The greatest pushers in this country today are the missionaries who make and distribute LSD because they are convinced that it's a wonderful way. As that poisonous, evil man, Dr. Timothy Leary, has said, it is a way to turn on, tune in, and drop out.
The topic tonight is the hippies, an understanding of whom we must, I guess, acquire or die painfully. Mr. Jack Kerouac over here became famous when his book On the Road was published. It seemed to be preaching a life of disengagement, making a virtue out of restlessness. Now, Jack, Mr. Kerouac, what I want to ask is this. To what extent do you believe that the Beat generation is related to the hippies?
Oh,
what do they have in common? Was this an evolution from the one to the other?
They're just the older ones.
Yeah.
So I'm 46 years old. These kids are 18. It's the same movement, which is apparently some kind of Dionysian movement. It's just a movement which is supposed to be licentious, but it isn't really.
Well, now, licentious in what respect?
The hippies are good kids. They're better than the Beat. The Beats, see, Ginsberg and I, and, wow, Ginsberg, boy. We're 40, we're all in our 40s, and we started this, and the kids took it up and everything. But a lot of hoodlums, and communists jumped on our backs. Well, on my back, not his. Ferlinghetti jumped on my back and turned the idea that I had that the Beat generation was a generation of beatitude and pleasure in life and tenderness. But they called it in the papers Beat mutiny, Beat insurrection. Words I never used. Being a Catholic, I believe in order, tenderness, and piety.
But I want to know why this schizophrenia.
I'm trying to share time with a mind that I tremendously respect. I want to get you interested in this problem of millions of Americans having St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine experiences. It's happening around you. I want to turn you on, Bill. I want to get you to drop out. I admire this man very much, and it's a tragedy to me that one of the greatest minds in America is involved with such trivia as the mayoralty election in New York. Or you're much too big for that.
I agree. How about one
I want to turn you on and drop you out.
Who is Timothy Leary? Who is he as a person?
I'm a philosopher. I'm a psychologist who has been studying the nervous system for the last 30 years. I've written 10 books and hundreds of articles. I probably know as much or more about how the nervous system works, the far galactic outposts of awareness and the range of the human experience as any scientist around.
Following in his father's footsteps, young Timothy went on to become a cadet at West Point. But in his first year, Leary was caught drunk. Worse, when questioned about it, he lied. That was a breach of West Point's honor code. When he refused to resign, the senior cadets silenced him, forbade him to speak to anyone. Leary endured his isolation for 10 months before resigning. The next year, 1942, he was expelled from Alabama University after being found in the girls' dormitory. In 1946, Timothy Leary was all set for a glittering but conventional career. A 25-year-old clinical psychologist, he had just arrived at the University of California at Berkeley to work on his PhD. Leary made his name with a pioneering research project on personality. He and several colleagues charted the characteristics people display in their various relationships. Then Leary organized them, for the first time, into a model for other therapists to use for diagnosis. Leary's book won acclaim from the American Psychology Association.
I visited Tim in Florence, and after a couple of days I told him I had very recently sample the actual mushrooms, not a pill, but the actual mushrooms of the Mazatec Indians, the so-called sacred mushroom. And I told him that this was important to psychology because it gave me moments of insight into certain things that happened during the war, for example, traumatic episodes that I had suppressed. And he said, Frank, you'd better not tell many people about this, because, and no psychologists, because they'll think you're nuts.
When, Doctor, did you first start experimenting with LSD?
6 years ago.
And that was during the time that you were on the faculty?
I was teaching psychology at Harvard. I'd been a psychologist for 15 years.
Right.
And I'd come to the sorry conclusion that psychology wasn't doing much to solve the emotional or the mental problems of the human race, and particularly the American people. So I went to Mexico, and a friend of mine who was an anthropologist told me about a method which had been used by the Indians in Mexico, the medicine men, the priests, before the white man came.
The fungi were placed on a table by the pool. I picked one up. It tasted even worse than it looked. Bitter, stringy. I began to feel strange, mildly nauseous, detached. Everything was quivering with life, even inanimate objects. I gave way to delight and discovered a sea of possibilities, other realities. By that swimming pool, I learned more about the mind than I had in 15 years as a diligent psychologist.
It was 1960. At the age of 40, Leary's adventures with mind-altering psychedelic drugs had begun.
He said to me then, "You were right. This is a very important potential tool, and it's going to affect all society, I think," is what he said.
Teaming up with a colleague, Richard Alpert, Leary won approval for a research project exploring the potential benefits of the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, psilocybin. Leary and his project were certainly popular with graduate students. Psychedelic drugs were legal then, and most of the graduate students in psychology said yes to Leary, leaving his colleagues short of research assistants.
Some of the best and brightest students were attracted to this project, and it created a bit of jealousy and envy.
One project did yield remarkable results. The Marsh Chapel experiment was designed by a graduate student under Leary's supervision. It investigated whether psilocybin, taken in a religious setting, could induce experiences comparable to those described by the great mystics. Randall Larco was one of 10 theology students who took the psilocybin.
I had a real struggle with the chemical, and at one point I thought, in fact, I had died and I was in hell. I began saying the Bible verse, "For God so loves the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life." And I kept repeating that over and over again, and then I came to the awareness that this wasn't helping me at all.
Larco fled from the chapel, with Leary following. Outside, his terror evaporated.
It was a glorious sunny day, and I remember seeing an elderly couple walking down the sidewalk hand in hand, and that was the most profound and beautiful experience to me. This was an image of people who indeed loved one another and had lived their lives together. Everything in the world just seemed to glow inwardly with life. Everything was alive, and I don't mean just living things, but even inanimate things. They just lived. And I was seeing things like I had never seen them before.
Leary steered Larco back into the chapel.
I do remember lying down on the floor. Leary lay right next to me, almost as though we were lovers. I can remember the smell of his hair, being extremely physically close, and then feeling my hand run down his body, touching him. What he was doing was giving me human contact again.
9 of the 10 theology students reported that they had indeed experienced something like a mystical revelation.
I would say, yeah, it did change my life. The experience that day demonstrated to me the reality of God's presence in all the world and in all experience. If our eyes are opened and we are able to perceive and take that in. And by eyes, I mean our spiritual inner awarenesses.
The experiment had demonstrated that psychedelics could indeed open the doors of perception. Leary argued that only by taking psilocybin could his researchers understand its effect on consciousness. But much of his research was done at his Harvard home, and the line between research and pleasure blurred. His pet project on psychedelics and creativity brought a stream of artists and writers to his house, among them the poet Allen Ginsberg.
Leary gave Ginsberg and his lover, Peter Orlovsky, the psilocybin, and they promptly took off their clothes and lounged around. And then at a certain point, Ginsberg decided that he wanted to do something for world peace, and so he would call up Kennedy and Khrushchev, get them all on the phone, and solve this problem about the bomb and everything right then and there. They weren't able to get the 2 most powerful men in the world on the phone, so they settled for Jack Kerouac.
Harvard's controversy over psychedelic drugs now became national news. In the end, Leary's colleague, Richard Alpert, became the first professor to be fired from Harvard in almost a century for giving psilocybin to an undergraduate. When Alpert left, Leary went with him. Leary and Alpert looked for the right surroundings in which to continue to spread the word about psychedelic drugs. Their savior was Leary's close friend, Peggy Hitchcock.
We went up to see if this old house might work as a haven for this little group of people who had sort of found themselves exiled from where they'd been living. And so we did. We saw this house and it looked like it would be just perfect.
Peggy came from one of America's wealthiest families. The old house was a 64-room mansion set in 2,000 acres of upstate New York. It was owned by her brothers, and Leary lived here at Millbrook, virtually rent-free, for the next 4 years. By now, Leary had moved on to a more powerful, but still legal, psychedelic drug, LSD.
LSD was guaranteed to really take you to a place that was very much more of a rebirth, death and rebirth experience, which was exciting, but also could be quite terrifying.
At first, Leary pursued a disciplined regime. Visitors paid for weekend seminars where they were taught how best to use LSD.
Soon Tim sort of gave in to the extraordinary adulation that he was getting as a cult figure, and the word was barely used in America in 1964-65, a guru.
It's estimated by the Federal Food and Drug Administration that perhaps 15 or 20% of our young people today are exploring their consciousness, trying to find out more about their mind using these chemicals.
But aren't the majority of them doing it for kicks?
I don't think so. I've been on many television programs where middle-aged people sit around and shake their head and worry about the young people having kicks. In the first place, what is a kick? It is true that LSD provides an ecstatic experience. It gives you an incredibly pleasant experience. But this pleasure is not the pleasure that you get from a bottle of beer or that you get from watching even a good television show. The pleasure you get from LSD is being tuned in. You're turned on to your own nervous system. You're turned on to your own body. You're turned on to the incredible wisdom which lies inside every cell in your body. It's the ecstasy that a scientist gets when he suddenly has something open up to him.
The first time that I was harassed by the law was on a Saturday night at midnight. I was in my bedroom with my wife, and I was talking to my son, and the door banged open, and in came G. Gordon Liddy with 24 armed and booted sheriffs.
Warrant? Do you have a warrant in hand?
Yeah, but the warrant was they found no marijuana. The warrant was thrown out. They did confiscate a little plant we had on peat moss, which was a geranium. But Gordon Liddy then ran for Congress on the basis that he had driven me out of the county, and from there he went to White House as a drug expert. And how did Gordon Liddy get to be a drug expert? Because he had fought Timothy Leary. This has been well known. It's been testified to recently, and that was 1966. And since then, I've been in continual. I know exactly how that system works. So your phone's being bugged, being harassed, and so forth.
By the winter of 1965, even Leary wanted a break from all the attention. He left Millbrook with Rosemary and his children, Jack and Susan, now teenagers, and headed south. At the Mexican border, they were sent back by a policeman whom Leary recognized from an earlier stay in Mexico. Returning to the American side, they were stopped and strip-searched.
It was at that point, I believe, that we recognized that perhaps we'd been set up for this, that our phone had been tapped. That was the only way they could have known that we were going to cross at that particular point, was because we'd mentioned it on the phone, and no other reason for that policeman to have been there.
1/8 of an ounce of marijuana was found, most of it in daughter Susan's underwear. Her father took responsibility. It was his first offense, but his notoriety earned him a 30-year prison sentence.
They gave him the Leary interpersonal diagnostic test, which he had designed back at Stanford. It's a test to divides you 64,000 personalities. And he answered all the questions, so he came out as docile, easily led, looking for leadership. So they put him in a minimum security prison, and he climbed a rope and went to
Leary and Rosemary were smuggled out of the country by the Weathermen, an underground group committed to subverting the American establishment. They delivered Leary to Algeria, where the Black Panthers, the most militant of America's radical organizations, had a government in exile, led by Eldridge Cleaver.
My plans are to work with the Black Panther Party for the overthrow of the American government.
Where do you expect to be doing this work?
Throughout the world. Of course, they're based, the international section is based in Algeria, but we're likely to show up any place. North Vietnam, North Korea, wherever people are struggling for freedom, we'll be there.
The hopes were that this would create a kind of united front between the hippies and the leftists and the Panthers by putting Cleaver and Leary together. It failed miserably.
Doing their bit for the revolution in Babylon.
But the Learys and the Panthers didn't see eye to eye on the revolution.
We had thought of the Black Panthers as our cultural heroes, but they thought we were irresponsible hippies.
As the Learys prepared for yet another dinner party, they received a visit from the Panthers.
Shortly before our guests were expected, Eldridge and several Panthers burst into the apartment and dragged us off.
Forced to flee from Algeria, Leary spent a further 18 months on the run from the American authorities. He split up with Rosemary and was finally recaptured by American agents in Afghanistan.
Last January in Afghanistan, the American government agents, they're part of that same Liddy, Narcotics Bureau group, stole my passport illegally, kidnapped me.
Valid passport?
It was a valid passport on the sovereign territory of Afghanistan, kidnapped me, put me in a plane, brought me back, and now I'm in Folsom Prison, and I'm broadcasting again.
You've been arrested a number of times for possession of marijuana. Were any of those legitimate?
No, as a matter of fact, I've never been legitimately arrested. I'm in prison now because one evening I was in a parked car and a policeman came up to the car and opened the door against my wishes, made a pass of the ashtray and said, "You're under arrest for," I said, "For what?" He said, "For marijuana." I said, "What marijuana?" He reached in his pocket, he pulled out 2 joints I'd never seen before, half joints, and said, "You're under arrest." A year later, an Orange County, Orange County jury believed the policeman's story and found me guilty of possession of marijuana. Now then the judge, instead of giving me bail as I was entitled to for appeal, held up a book that I had been writing and said, your ideas are dangerous and we're not going to give you bail and we'll put you in prison to keep you quiet. I've been through a lot of rough time the last few years. My career has been ruined and they took my credit card away at Harvard and I've been harassed by the United States government pretty heavily. I've been in 4 prisons, all without committing any crime that I know of. I've been in solitary confinement for 4 months. In addition to all of these pressures, I probably pushed my nervous system as much as any human being living. I think I'm the strongest, sanest person around.
Whoa, I'm back. Got a brand new groove.
After cooperating with the FBI, Leary was back on the streets in 1975. In demand on the chat show circuit, he continued to push his favorite message. Think for yourself, question authority.
Good for Eve. I love to be descended from Eve. The first human being was a woman who stood up on her 2 feet and took the fruit and said, hey, if this is the tree of knowledge, I'm going to eat it because I'm a human being, and forget it, Jehovah, forget it. Go back to, jump in your squad car and go back to headquarters, Jehovah.
He cannot deny it. He's a self-confessed lawyer.
His comeback was complete when he played out a bizarre double act in a lecture tour with his former archenemy, G. Gordon Liddy.
The real difference between us, the 180 degrees, is not left wing or right wing, it's past versus future. And Mr. Liddy is definitely facing backward, worshiping tradition. And I'm a futurist.
By 1990, Leary was divorced and alone again. In 1995, he learned he had cancer.
The way that he told me, which was, oh, did you hear, by the way, I've got prostate cancer and I've decided, this is death is the last taboo and this is what we're going to do, was attacked with as much of enthusiasm as anything else.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you, Bob, for coming here at the last minute.
Oh, my pleasure.
But it was very fortuitous that you were in town, because this was supposed to be a show that Timothy Leary was going to do with us, and we invited some of his friends on, because, as you know, I'm not talking out of school here, he is unfortunately at death's door. And he has been plugging it. So we're not... I've never seen a guy plug his death, but
he's
Tim...
He's a real party animal, He's really intent on making this, like, lots of fun for him and all of his friends.
That's why I thought this would be a fun thing, but unfortunately today was one of those days that he just couldn't make it. So we're really sad about that, but I think
But if you're going to have an excuse, Yeah. It's also about his taking a stand for something which was very difficult to take in the time he did it. I mean, we can get up on this show now and sit here and talk. This is going to go out over national television. We're talking about I took acid. You couldn't do that back then. And for him to do that and take that stance and still never back down is really admirable.
It really is. He's a very honest man.
And he did the time for it. Would you give advice on the use of drugs nowadays?
Yeah, I should do that, and I'll look right into the eyes of everyone that's watching this program and say that I don't urge you to take LSD in particular. LSD is the most powerful substance that a human being has ever developed for influencing the mind. I've used the comparison of nuclear energy or fissionable material. I think that in the right hands and scientific and disciplined and hopeful people, it will bring about changes. But I don't want anyone to listen to this broadcast to get any other message that I'm telling you, stay away from LSD. In the first place, 99% of what's called LSD is LSD. And 99% of the things that are said about LSD are totally lies or fabrications. The whole thing is so confused now that I'll flatly make that statement. My main advice to everyone is we've got to learn how to use our heads. We've got to realize that the nervous system can be used as an instrument to help us understand why we're here and where we're going. I think we've got to change. We'd like to see the United States move into its third century with the same spirit we had 200 years ago, a spirit of novelty, of something great and imaginative and freeing, so that we can have the pride that Americans used to feel. Now, as I look around since I've been back, I don't see that Mr. Nixon or the Democrats have a program that's going to lead us into the third century with this vigor that we need. We'll limp or crawl or kind of stagger into the third century, which I think is a tragedy.